Some people in your life don't just dislike you. They resent you deeply, and they're smiling to your face while doing it. And the uncomfortable truth? It's not always because you did something wrong. It's often because you did something right. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how certain people become distant when you start doing better? Or how someone suddenly becomes critical the moment you stop tolerating their behavior? That's not coincidence. That's psychology. We like to believe that if we're kind, respectful, and good, we'll be liked. But human behavior doesn't work that way. Sometimes the very traits that make you strong are the exact reasons someone quietly resents you. Most people imagine dislike as something obvious. Raised voices, open criticism, clear rejection. But in reality, resentment is far quieter and far more socially acceptable when it's hidden. People learn early on that expressing dislike directly can damage their image. So instead, they mask it behind politeness, neutral expressions, or even friendliness. This creates a confusing dynamic where someone appears supportive on the surface, but behaves in subtly undermining ways underneath. You might notice a lack of enthusiasm when you share good news, delayed responses, minimal effort in maintaining the relationship, or small dismissive comments disguised as jokes. These are not random behaviors. They are controlled expressions of discomfort or envy that the person doesn't want to openly admit, even to themselves. This kind of silent resentment often comes from internal conflict. A person may feel threatened, insecure, or inferior in comparison, but instead of confronting those feelings, they suppress them. Since openly acknowledging envy or insecurity is uncomfortable, the mind redirects that tension outward in indirect ways. That's why the behavior feels inconsistent, because it is. On one level, they want to maintain a socially acceptable relationship with you, but on another level, your presence triggers something unresolved within them. What makes this especially difficult is that it leaves you questioning your own perception. There's no clear event to point to, no direct confrontation to address, just a pattern of subtle negativity that's easy to dismiss but hard to ignore. Over time, this can create emotional confusion because you're responding not to what is being said openly, but to what is being communicated underneath. Confidence doesn't exist in isolation. It's always being measured, consciously or unconsciously, by the people around you. When someone sees you expressing certainty, making decisions without excessive validation, or carrying yourself with a sense of self-trust, it can quietly disrupt how they see themselves. If they struggle with self-doubt, hesitation, or a need for approval, your confidence becomes a mirror they didn't ask for. Instead of feeling inspired, many people feel exposed. It highlights a gap between who they are and who they believe they should be, and that gap creates discomfort. Rather than processing that discomfort internally, it often gets redirected outward. Your confidence may be reframed as arrogance, your independence as coldness, your decisiveness as stubbornness. These labels are not always accurate. They're protective narratives. By diminishing your confidence, they can avoid confronting their own insecurity. It's easier to believe that you think too highly of yourself than to admit they don't think highly enough of themselves. This reaction is especially strong in environments where comparison is constant. Workplaces, social groups, even friendships built on subtle competition. When someone has unconsciously defined their worth relative to others, your growth or self-assurance can feel like a threat to their position. It challenges the balance they were comfortable with. If you were once more uncertain, more accommodating, or more reliant on their approval, your shift into confidence changes the dynamic. They may feel less needed, less superior, or less in control. What makes this complex is that your confidence isn't actually directed at them, but it still affects them. It forces an internal evaluation they may not be ready to face, and instead of engaging with that process, they resist it by quietly pulling away or reinterpreting your behavior in a negative light. When you start setting boundaries, you're not just changing your behavior, you're disrupting patterns that other people may have grown comfortable relying on. Boundaries are often misunderstood as rejection or hostility, especially by those who benefited from your previous lack of limits. If you were once accommodating, always available, or willing to tolerate things that didn't sit well with you, people may have unconsciously built expectations around that version of you. The moment you begin to say no, take space, or question what you accept, it creates friction because those expectations are no longer being met. This is where offense comes in. For someone who has grown used to access, control, or emotional convenience, your boundary doesn't feel like a neutral adjustment. It feels like a personal loss. Instead of recognizing that you are simply redefining what is acceptable for you, they may interpret it as you pulling away from them specifically. The focus shifts from your self-respect to their perceived rejection. That's why reactions can seem disproportionate. A simple, "I can't do that," might be met with irritation, guilt-tripping, or passive resistance, not because the request was unreasonable, but because the dynamic has changed. There's also an underlying psychological element tied to entitlement. When someone repeatedly benefits from your flexibility, they can begin to see it as something they are owed, rather than something you are choosing to give. So when that access is reduced, it doesn't register as a boundary. It registers as something being taken away. This can trigger defensiveness, subtle resentment, or attempts to push against your limits to see if they still hold. The discomfort they feel is less about your boundary itself and more about losing the version of you that made things easier for them. Not explaining yourself is one of those subtle behavioral shifts that changes how people experience you far more than they expect. When you stop offering long justifications for your choices, decisions, or boundaries, you remove the emotional cushion that many people rely on to feel comfortable with your actions. A lot of social interaction is built on the assumption that behavior will be softened through explanation. "I can't come because I'm busy," followed by detailed reasoning that reassures the other person they are not being rejected personally. When that extra layer disappears, people are left alone with the raw impact of your decision, and that creates discomfort. For some individuals, explanations are not just communication tools, but emotional reassurance. They use your reasoning to evaluate whether they are still important, still considered, or still in control of the relationship dynamic. When you stop over-explaining, you unintentionally remove their ability to negotiate, question, or emotionally reposition your choices. That loss of access can feel unsettling, especially for people who are used to having your internal thought process made visible to them. Silence or brevity can feel like distance, even when no emotional distance is intended. This shift also changes perceived authority. A person who constantly justifies themselves can appear uncertain, as if their decisions require approval. But someone who states things simply and firmly, without elaboration, signals internal clarity. That clarity can be misread as coldness or detachment by those who depend on emotional accessibility. Instead of seeing confidence, they may interpret it as withholding or arrogance, because they are no longer being invited into your reasoning process. Over time, this creates a new dynamic where your boundaries or decisions are no longer open for discussion in the same way. Some people will adapt to it, while others will resist it because it removes a layer of influence they didn't realize they were using. If this is hitting a little too close to home, pause for a second and ask yourself, who became uncomfortable when I started changing? That answer will tell you more than anything I say next. Your growth doesn't happen in isolation, even though it feels internal to you. It becomes visible through behavior, priorities, conversations, and the way you respond to situations differently than before. When you start improving, emotionally, financially, mentally, or socially, it creates a silent comparison point for the people who have remained in the same place. Not because you are actively comparing, but because change naturally creates contrast. That contrast is where discomfort begins for others. For someone who is stagnant in an area of life they care about, your progress can act like a reminder of what they have not addressed. It doesn't need to be dramatic success either. Even small shifts, more discipline, better boundaries, clearer communication, or increased self-respect, can highlight inertia in others. The mind often interprets that contrast not as inspiration, but as pressure, because it forces an unspoken question. Why am I not doing the same? Instead of sitting with that question, many people unconsciously redirect the discomfort outward. They may minimize your progress, change the subject when you share achievements, or subtly downplay the effort behind your growth. In some cases, they might even distance themselves, not because you have changed in a harmful way, but because your evolution disrupts the emotional equilibrium they were used to. If they felt relatively stable or comfortable around your previous version, your new version changes that balance. There is also a social identity aspect involved. People often build a sense of self within a group based on relative positions: who is struggling, who is improving, who is ahead or behind. When your trajectory shifts upward, it can unintentionally destabilize how they locate themselves within that informal hierarchy. This can lead to defensiveness, subtle criticism, or even passive disengagement. What makes this especially complex is that your growth is not directed at anyone, yet it still lands as a comparison in their internal narrative. The discomfort they experience is less about your actions and more about the reflection those actions create in their own self-assessment, something they may not openly acknowledge or may not fully recognize while it's happening. When people project their flaws onto you, they are essentially using you as a psychological screen to avoid facing parts of themselves they are uncomfortable with. Projection is not a conscious decision most of the time. It is a defense mechanism that operates automatically when someone feels emotionally threatened or internally conflicted. Instead of acknowledging a trait within themselves, such as insecurity, jealousy, dishonesty, or lack of discipline, they displace that discomfort and assign it to someone else. This helps them temporarily reduce internal tension because it is easier to criticize or judge another person than to self-reflect. In social interactions, this can show up in very subtle but confusing ways. Someone who struggles with insecurity might accuse you of being arrogant simply because you carry yourself with certainty. A person who has difficulty being honest with themselves or others might interpret your straightforwardness as aggression or insensitivity. In reality, what they are reacting to is not your behavior itself, but the emotional discomfort it triggers in them. The mind often seeks coherence, so it reshapes your actions into a version that fits their internal narrative, even if that narrative is inaccurate. Projection also serves as a form of emotional protection in relationships where comparison or status awareness is present. If someone feels they are falling short in certain areas of life, acknowledging that gap directly can be painful. So instead of saying, "I feel inadequate in this situation," the mind converts it into, "You are the problem in this situation." This shift allows them to preserve self-image while avoiding vulnerability. Over time, repeated projection can distort how they perceive you because they begin interacting more with their interpretation of you than with who you actually are. What makes this particularly challenging is that it often feels personal on the receiving end. You may find yourself defending actions or intentions that were never rooted in negativity to begin with. However, the real source of conflict is not your behavior, but the internal struggles the other person has not resolved within themselves, which get externalized onto you without awareness or intent to be fair or accurate. Trying to be liked by everyone creates a constant internal pressure to adjust yourself depending on who is in front of you. Over time, this leads to small but repeated compromises in how you speak, what you express, and even what you believe. Instead of acting from a stable sense of self, you start acting from anticipation, calculating reactions before they happen, softening opinions before they are formed, and avoiding anything that might create disagreement. On the surface, this may look like harmony, but internally, it creates fragmentation because you are no longer consistent with yourself. People-pleasing also trains others to expect a version of you that is always agreeable, available, and non-confrontational. When you operate this way for a long time, it becomes your social identity in their eyes. So when you finally begin to assert yourself, set boundaries, or express disagreement, it disrupts that established expectation. The shift can feel uncomfortable to others, not because you have changed in a negative way, but because you have stopped reinforcing a role they were used to benefiting from. The deeper cost is internal. When your primary goal is acceptance, your decisions become externally validated rather than internally grounded. You start measuring your worth through reactions instead of self-alignment. This creates anxiety, resentment, and confusion because no matter how much approval you receive, it never feels stable or enough. Over time, the need to be liked by everyone leads not to belonging, but to a gradual loss of clarity about who you actually are when no one is watching or judging. The moment you start becoming more authentic, your behavior becomes less predictable to the people around you. Authenticity means you are no longer filtering yourself through constant approval seeking or fear of judgment. So your reactions, preferences, and boundaries begin to reflect your actual thoughts rather than what others expect. This shift changes how people relate to you because many relationships are built on a stable, familiar version of who you are. When that version changes, even in healthy ways, it can feel unsettling to those who relied on your predictability for emotional comfort or social ease. Selectivity naturally follows authenticity because you stop investing equal energy into all relationships. You begin to notice who respects your boundaries, who values reciprocity, and who only engages when it benefits them. As a result, your social circle starts to shrink or reorganize. This is not rejection in a dramatic sense, but refinement. However, people who are no longer in your closer orbit may interpret this shift personally, especially if they were used to your constant availability or emotional accessibility. The discomfort others feel often comes from loss of access rather than actual conflict. When you become more selective, you are no longer automatically available for validation, attention, or support in the same way. That absence forces people to reassess their position in your life, which can create quiet resistance or subtle resentment. At the same time, your increased authenticity can unintentionally highlight differences between who is growing alongside you and who is remaining in old patterns, which further intensifies emotional distance without any direct confrontation. What all of this really comes down to is not that people secretly hate you in some universal or absolute way, but that human beings react strongly to emotional discomfort they don't fully understand or want to face. When you grow, change, set boundaries, stop over-explaining, or become more authentic, you are not just altering your behavior, you are altering the emotional environment around you. Some people adjust to that shift, some reflect on it, and some resist it. The resistance is often what gets interpreted as dislike or resentment, but underneath it is usually insecurity, comparison, unmet expectations, or a loss of familiarity. The difficult truth is that you cannot evolve without disrupting certain dynamics. Every time you step into a stronger, clearer version of yourself, you automatically become less compatible with environments or relationships built around your older patterns. That doesn't make you wrong or others malicious. It simply reveals misalignment. And misalignment often feels like tension before it feels like clarity. If there is one thing to take from this, it is that being understood by everyone is not a sign of emotional health or success. In many cases, it is a sign that you have made yourself small enough to avoid friction. Real growth comes with selectivity, misunderstanding, and sometimes quiet resistance from others. But it also comes with something far more valuable: self-respect, clarity, and relationships that are based on authenticity rather than performance.